Grandpa Dale today, and we're just going to learn a little bit about him and his life. Can you say hi, Grandpa? So let's start from the beginning. Can you tell me what year you were born and where you were born and raised?
I can probably do better than that. I was actually born in December, 2 days before Christmas, 23rd of December, 1935. But I have a pretty good idea when I was conceived.
Oh, perfect.
I was conceived at the onset of the space age. This is true.
I believe you.
This is true. My father was a cavalry NCO, and my mother was a nurse at the local Army hospital. That's where they met.
Sure.
And one of their first details that they were jointly involved in was the stratosphere balloon flight in 1934 from the Stratosphere Bowl of the Black Hills of South Dakota. They were both stationed in Sturgis, South Dakota, and when the National Geographic and the U.S. Army Air Corps merged together to make this balloon flight the first time that a man would go into the stratosphere, they were part of the staff. My mother was on the medical staff, and my dad was on the security staff. And that was in 1934. And that first flight was a failure. The balloon burst, and the two astronauts, the precursor of astronauts, parachuted to safety. Okay. And then a year later, they reconstituted that. But my mother was pregnant with me at that time, and so she didn't get to go on the second try. But I was there at the onset in the first try.
Wow. They
didn't make it, but I still claim that I was born at the dawn of the space age.
That's amazing.
My mother had graduated from nurses training in Rapid City, South Dakota. And that's where I was born, in the same hospital that she went to for training. My dad was a NCO in the 4th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Meade, South Dakota. And my father, who was an Iowa farm boy, who left the farm so that he wouldn't have to be the hired hand taking care of all the chores. He wanted to get out to the world, and that's why he left Iowa. In those days, if you wanted to join the Army, you had to find a vacancy. And so he went looking for a job, and he found one in the 4th Cavalry in Fort Meade, South Dakota. I was very proud of my father, and I still am proud of my father. He held every rank between recruit, when he entered the Army, and lieutenant colonel, except for sergeant major. He was an NCO in the 1930s. When the war started in 1941, he went to OCS. He was commissioned, and then he held the ranks of an officer.
Okay, wow.
From 1942 on. My mother was a remarkable woman. She was raised on a sheep ranch in the northwest part of South Dakota. She used to say, and we would kid her, that she was exaggerating, but she used to say that she had to walk 3 miles to school and carried her lunch and went through snow drifts, and it was really tough in those days.
I'm sure.
It was always tougher in those days. But she graduated a year early from high school, and that's when she went to nurses training. She was she was born into a sheep ranch. Her father died when she was about 13 years old. So I never knew my grandfather, my real grandfather. My grandfather was actually homesteading in around Rapid City in the Black Hills, and they were opening up part of South Dakota for more homesteading, and he decided that he needed a wife, and so he went back to where his roots were, which was in Missouri. And he appeared in this small town in Missouri and started courting the widow Williams. And the widow Williams had 3 or 4 daughters, and as I mentioned earlier, a couple of sons. And he came around quite often, and everyone assumed that he was going to ask for the hand of the widow Williams. But he ended up asking for the hand of the widow Williams' daughter, who was my grandmother, and was at that time 17 years old.
Wow.
And so she ended up going with him up to South Dakota to set up the homestead that I always remembered as the ranch.
Sure.
And she always said that she had to lie about her age because she was 17 and you couldn't assign for a homestead if you weren't 18 at least. So she had to lie about her age in order to marry Dyson Byers, my grandfather, and then the 2 of them set up the homestead, and they were the first ones to occupy it. And interestingly, the very first building that they had to build, you had to build a house on the homestead to make it a homestead. The house they built was built out of sod. It was dug into the side of a hill. And when I was a young boy, probably 4 or 5 years old, I can remember going to the sod house, and because it had been converted into a chicken coop, and there were all kinds of chicken nests in there.
Oh, so they had moved out.
I picked up the eggs. Yeah, they'd moved out of it into a wood frame house, which is the one I remember that they lived in. And but I would gather the eggs and bring them down to the kitchen in my grandmother's farmhouse.
That's great.
Yeah.
What would you say some of your earliest childhood memories are?
Well, those are among them. I was probably 4 or 5. I have some pretty vivid memories about cactuses because I went out several times with my father. He was going pheasant hunting and he took me along, and I was supposed to be very quiet because we didn't want to spook the pheasant, and I spooked him by stepping on a cactus and then screaming like crazy. And I remember very vividly that my father, he was compassionate enough to know I had stepped on a cactus, but he was not very happy with me for spooking the pheasant.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But I do remember going around the barracks and the stables and seeing the soldiers, seeing the horses. So I don't remember my natural grandfather, but I do remember Grandpa Tobel and Grandma Tobel, who was my real grandmother. My real grandmother came from Missouri. She was from a large family, several sisters and a couple of brothers who we didn't maintain contact with. They kind of remained down in Missouri, and the Dakota Tobel family and Byers family were pretty much separate from those people who were in Missouri. My grandmother was a marvelous person. She was not only ran most of the ranch, but she ran a huge garden that provided all kinds of vegetables and fruits, and she put up preserves and canned and bottled things that kept the entire neighborhood in freshly canned and preserved foods throughout the winters and so forth. She was very talented. My grandfather, my natural grandfather, Byers, was very perceptive, and he realized that out there in the prairies, what you really needed were a lot of trees, and there weren't any. So he ordered trees from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and would drive his horse and wagon down to the railroad station, and they would pick up a complete wagon load of saplings. And he planted trees before my mother was even born. And even today, when you drive in that stretch of road, you can see those trees from 30 or 40 miles away because they're the only trees in the entire horizon. This grove of trees that he planted probably right around 1900. But the cottonwoods they tower over the stream and the house. The house is gone now. It's pretty well, I've seen pictures recently taken by some of my cousins, and it's dilapidated. I don't know who owns it now. So that's pretty much where my roots are.
Yeah.
And I have good, vivid memories of them.
Can you tell me a little bit about your brother Ken, your younger brother?
Yeah, my brother Ken is 3 years younger than I. And I'll say right up front, he's my best friend. And he always has been. He's a very skilled and talented and intelligent guy. And we've always gotten along very, very well. Although I've heard stories that I beat him up when I was a big brother.
Understandable.
But I also protected him and looked out for him. And I think I did my share of being a big brother and taking care of him. Ken, when I went to West Point, he hadn't made his mind up. He was skillful, and he passed a lot of exams, and he received a free ride to several very prestigious schools. He was given a free ride to Harvard, Yale, the University of Washington, and he got an appointment to West Point, and he chose West Point. He was a very successful student at the high school level, and did great at West Point too. He was a plebe when I was a first-classman, so he arrived as a plebe just as I was starting my last year there, and that's probably when I did the best job of being a big brother, taking care of him and making sure that the upperclassmen treated him fairly and so forth.
Looking out for him.
Yeah.
That's great. Do you have any specific memories of Ken from when you were younger and kind of growing up?
We did everything together. He was remarkable. I think he was probably about 3, and he could recite his ABCs, which was just stunning. And I exploited him a little bit. We were stationed in I think it was Neosho, Missouri. My father was. This was just before World War II started. My father was going through some training down there, and the whole family we all moved down there in Neosho, Missouri, and we lived in a right outside the base, and I found that this little 3-year-old brother of mine, who could recite the ABCs, was a phenomenon, and I would take him down to the drugstore where there were a bunch of old men sitting around drinking Coca-Colas and so forth, and I would say to them, this little guy knows his ABCs, and if you give me a nickel, I'll let him demonstrate. So he would demonstrate, and I'd go around, pick up nickels, and then we'd go into the drugstore and buy candy and Cokes and things. So
it's a good party.
I've been accused of exploiting my little brother for that. He was always precocious, and very bright, and still is.
Yeah. That's great. You mentioned moving down to Missouri. What were some of the other places that your father's career brought you guys over the years before?
Well, I'll put it in one summary statement. Mm-hmm. When I graduated from West Point, when I entered West Point, mm-hmm. which I attended for 4 years, that was the 17th school that I attended. That was the 17th school, and it was during World War II, and we moved around. I was in 3 different schools in Omaha, Nebraska. I was in 2 schools in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I was in two schools in, no, one school in Iowa, three schools in Japan, one school in Germany.
Wow.
But it totals up to 17 schools. So we did hop around, bounce around, but those were formative years, and we learned how to be flexible,
Mm-hmm.
make friends fast.
I'm sure that helped you in your career.
It was, yeah, that's right. It was certainly put me in good stead there.
Yeah. What were some of your favorite places that you lived or visited along the way?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think probably Omaha was the least favorite, if I could start there.
Sure.
Omaha was it was just tough to live there. I was in the third grade and went to three schools there. Never really got settled, and then my dad went overseas, and so we moved to Iowa. And so my memories of Iowa are I learned to swim there, but I wouldn't give up Omaha very high. I shouldn't start on a negative, but I love Japan. Absolutely loved living in Japan. And I love Germany. I loved living in Germany. Both of those experiences were impacted by the fact that it was just after the war. We went to Japan. We were the first group of dependents to sail to Japan in 46. So the war was over in 46. And no, we went in 47, and we came back in 49. We were on the first boatload of dependents to arrive there. My dad had already been there a year, and they had no place for us to live, so we spent our first 6 months living high in the mountains on the Sea of Japan, which is the western part of the island of Honshu, and we were in a resort hotel. It was just lovely. Had sliding bamboo paper doors and windows, and rice mat that you crawled around. Always took your shoes off,
Mm-hmm.
which was strange for an American boy to. You take your shoes off to go inside. We didn't do that in Iowa or in Omaha. But it was just marvelous. It's a beautiful country, and we had they were recovering from World War II. The area between Tokyo and Yokohama, where we ended up living, was just absolutely leveled by fire bombs that had been dropped during the war. And there were a few houses being built, very, very sparsely. There were bulldozers everywhere pushing rubble around, getting ready to rebuild Japan. The Japanese were, I'd say, to a man, my memory of them was they were polite, they were kind, they were thoughtful, and they treated us with utmost respect. Of course, we were, our country had conquered their country, so it was kind of understanding, but they were genuinely beautiful people, and their art and their literature, and I just gained a great appreciation for that, and I still to this day enjoy their art and their literature.
There's definitely a lot of influence in even your home, still to this day.
And when we went to Germany several years later, we had a similar experience.
Okay.
Germany had gone a little bit further in rebuilding by 1953, but we still enjoyed seeing the culture and traveling around Europe and seeing all the historical places.
Yeah.
So we had some wonderful experiences as a kid.
Yeah.
Great way
to grow up.
To grow up.
I'm sure. And so during those years, obviously moving around all those schools, you have to adjust and reinvent yourself. What kind of things did you do during your school years? What were your pastimes and activities or sports that you took part in?
Well, my father, I think, had it in his mind that I was going to go to West Point. I mean, that was kind of his thing. I was I thought I was going to go to medical school.
Oh, wow.
That was my
I didn't know
that
this.
was my plan. So I took Latin and chemistry and all those courses because that would be a preparation for pre-med. And I did apply to the University of Washington, but then I got an appointment to West Point. But my dad had it in mind that I couldn't get into West Point if I injured myself playing football. So all through my high school days, he didn't want me to play football. And so I didn't until my senior year. And in my senior year, we got to Munich, Germany, and Ken and I, as I said, we're close as can be. We went to the football coach and convinced him that we ought to have summer practice. We arrived in July, and the football coach said he never thought about that. And my dad agreed to let us play football. And he ended up being one of the great football fans of all parenthood. And Ken and I was a senior, Ken was a freshman, and we were part of a team that melded together, and we ended up being undefeated, and we won the USWR European Championship. And my dad was always very proud of us for being a part of that. So I participated in 1 year of high school football, and then I was a pole vaulter in the track team, and I did play basketball. For a high school student, I was pretty tall.
Yeah, you were tall.
So when I got to West Point, my first plebe year, I played football, I played basketball, and I ran track. But you can't do all of those things well, so I dropped football and I concentrated on pole vaulting. So my collegiate experience was all pole vaulting.
Wow.
In school, I was in the French club. I was in the thespian. I was a thespian.
Oh, another thing I didn't know.
I wasn't an actor, but I got involved in the interpretive reading, and I went into the state interpretive reading contest. I had a good English teacher who said you really ought to do this, and so I went to the state finals in the interpretive reading, and I read something from Shakespeare, which I could probably recite, but I can't think of it right now.
We'll get back to that. Oh, okay, in a few years.
And I was the editor of our yearbook when we were in Germany, my senior year, and I was vice president of the class.
Wow.
So I was a student in student government and a bunch of things like that.
Yeah, you were busy.
Yeah, well, keeps you out of trouble.
It's true. And
I had a lot of jobs. While I was living in Tacoma, Washington, for 2 years in the summer, I drove a laundry delivery truck. And I was a big guy, and I could carry the laundry. In those days, you carried the laundry, and the people paid you, and you gave them a receipt. And so there was a little bookkeeping involved. Then I also mowed lawns. I had my own lawnmower. And when I was in junior high school, I delivered papers. I delivered the Tacoma News Tribune, and you had to get up early in the morning, deliver the papers, pick up the papers, deliver them, and then on Saturdays when I went around to collect, I collected the money, but I also collected the papers. So I carry a wagon with me and bring the used papers, because I take those papers back, and I had an arrangement with a moving company. In those days, the moving companies didn't use recycled paper, they used actual newspapers to wrap up your glasses when they packed your household goods. And they would pay, I don't know, I think it was a nickel a pack for a roll of rolled newspapers. So I had a thing set up in our garden shed, and I'd bring all those newspapers back on Saturday, and I'd spend Saturday and part of Sunday rolling up these rolls of newspaper, and then we collect those, and then once a month I'd take them over to Mr. Courier's house, and he would then put them on his moving truck, and it was a way to earn gas money for my car.
Sure. What was your car? What was your first car?
Well, it was actually my dad's car, but you know, I had to put gas in it.
Fair enough.
So,
Fair enough. So I always just kind of assumed that you grew up with the West Point fever in your blood and that you knew that was where you're going to go. I didn't realize that you wanted to go to medical school, but once you got appointed, did you just know that that was what was right for you?
My dad was pretty clever.
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, you know, it wouldn't hurt for you to go take the exam.
Mm-hmm.
Just, you know, it's your junior year. I was, you know, in my junior year. So in my junior year, he arranged for me to take the exam. And I'll be damned if I didn't pass it, much to my surprise. And I had a pretty good chance to get an appointment, but he didn't want me either to not finish high school. So we cycled through, and I ended up finishing my high school properly and took it the second time, passed it again. But he was pretty clever. I think that by taking that exam my junior year in high school, it kind of said, well, hey, here's a free education, I may as well take advantage of it. But I still applied to the University of Washington. I was accepted, but I took the appointment to West Point.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your time at West Point? I know that it's an important part of your life, so just about those years and the people that you met and the impact it's had on you.
Well, I think they're the most important people in my life.
Yeah.
I met my wife there, the most important person. Some of my very best friends for all of my life. Those bonds were established when we were cadets together, and then we served subsequently several times with many of them, and you know, I still maintain close relationships with the people that were there with me at that time. It was a marvelous experience, no doubt about it. And I find it hard to put into words how important it was to me, and still is.
I can see it. Do you want me to zoom in on it?
Yeah, there you are.
Well, it's definitely, I mean, I know it led you to everything you have now, and your great military career and the career you had after, but most importantly, your wife. Can you tell me a little bit about meeting her and how that happened in your story?
You want the real story?
Yes, I do. That's why we're here. We want the real story.
Yeah. Well, when I was a plebe, at the beginning of plebe year, there's not a lot of highlights.
Mm-hmm.
One of the highlights of my first month or two months at West Point was the Army Daughter Tea. Mm-hmm. Now that's not the kind of activity that you would normally think plebes are involved in. And if it weren't for the Army Daughters, who were a group of Army daughters who were living there at West Point, and knew that there were some Army brats in the plebe class, and they invited those Army brats to come over for tea on one afternoon, and you talk about a relief from pressure cooker situation. That was it, and that's where I met the girl that I ended up courting and marrying. The first time I saw her was at that Army Daughter Tea in the Commandant's house, no, the Dean's house, the Bessel's house, as I recall. And then I got we went out to Camp Buckner for the yearling summer, and I got invited to a party by Dodie Reeder, and I guess the girl I was supposed to date didn't show, and so
St. Mary's reunion.
from St. Mary's convent school where Dodie went, and Dodie was very apologetic, and so I said, "Well, one way you can make up for that is to go out with me."
There you go.
And she agreed to a date. So she joined me one Sunday afternoon at Camp Buckner, and then she refused to come back for a second date. So we went for 2.5 years without seeing each other.
Mm.
And then
I was afraid I would like him too much.
Of course. How could you not?
But my senior year, my brother, who'll take full credit for this, but my brother was a plebe, and in those days, plebes didn't go home at Christmas time. So he was there. My parents flew from California so that they could be there, go to all the festivities and activities. And I didn't really want to go to all the plebe activities. I was a firstie, big guy on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And so there it was, my birthday, 23rd of December, and I picked up the phone and called Dodie Reeder and said, "Are you married or anything?" And she said, "Are you married or anything?" And the rest is history.
That's a great story.
Yeah. Well, it was a great story. She arrived that evening to go to the movies, as I recall, and she had birthday presents for me.
Oh.
And one of the birthday presents was one of these little magnetic things where you have a sketch of a man's head, and it's got all kinds of metal pilings,
Sure.
and you can use a magnet on the back and make this guy have a beard or hair. Or, I've always had a soft spot in my heart for beards and mustaches.
Yeah. You grew into that magnetic man with your own mustache. Well, that's great. All right, now we are going to talk with Grandma Dodie today and learn a little bit about her and her life. So, all right, Grandma, do you want to start by telling us your name and when you were born?
My name is Dorothea Williford Reeder Ruby. Dodie Ruby. I was born May 19th, 1937. I'm 84 years old, and I'm a happy camper. And I was born in Anniston, Alabama, Fort McClellan, and I'm an Army brat, and therefore I didn't stay in Alabama very long. My first memories are being in Panama. My brother Russell was born there in 1940, and I don't recall exactly when we arrived, but I was 3 years old. But I have memories of Panama, the rain. And one day in particular, my mother took all 4 of her children, Ann, Dodie, Julie, and Russell, in the car to the commissary and told us to stay in the car no matter what. And a thunderstorm proceeded, and we were scared to death, or I was scared to death. And I thought we'd never see my mother again. But the storms in Panama at that time were very intense and short, and she was back with us before we knew that. So I spent most of my childhood at West Point.
Yeah.
My father was wounded severely on the 6th day of the invasion of Normandy. He was commanding the 12th Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, and a tank exploded and he lost 12 inches of his bone in his left leg. And later, the doctor told him a year later, when they said they ought to amputate it, my father said, "What would you do if I had been an enlisted man?" And they said, "We would have amputated it on the battlefield."
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, "Take it off." And so the following year, that would have been 45, he got a job at West Point as the commander of the 2nd Regiment of Cadets. I'm not sure that's the exact title, but now they have 4 regiments, but at that time he only had 2, and he actually wore a uniform. He was a colonel at that time, and unfortunately, about 1947, the government allowed us how there were so many amputees, and they were trying to cut back on the Army, that the people who had been wounded amputees could no longer be retired on active duty and wear the uniform.
Mm.
So he was given a job, praise the Lord, at West Point as the assistant graduate manager of athletics. And we moved from one end of the post on the hill going to Nike Stadium to the hill above the cemetery, the post chapel. And at that time, that was the brand new quarters for the athletic coaches, and they decided that would be nice to have something other than just Earl Blake live on post. And my father, although he was not officially the baseball coach, he did coach the plebes baseball. He had been a big star as a cadet, and later, after he graduated, he had been offered a contract with the New York Giants, and he turned it down. He said it took him 6 years to get through West Point, and he thought he better stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but getting back to living in that loop, Vince Lombardi was our neighbor, as were several other famous coaches, and it was fun being there. I had a lot of interest at that time, early in my life, about ballet and ice skating. And I was very fortunate to have Barbara Cashon, my ballet teacher, take a personal interest in me, and Tish Heinlein, the 2 of us. She took us to New York City. She thought we were young proteges. I think she never knew I was going to grow up to be as tall and as big a girl as I am. But anyway, she was very taken with our abilities, and was able to secure scholarships for both of us at the Carnegie Hall Ballet Arts. And bless my mother's heart, she drove, I went more than Tish did. My mother drove me into New York City on a regular basis one summer. And I asked her later, I said, "Why did you, bless your heart, why did you spend that much time of your life and money and effort to take me into the New York City for these classes when I'm sure you realized I never was going to be a professional ballet dancer?" And she said, "Well, I never wanted you to be able to say you would have been such and such unless except my mother didn't help me take advantage of opportunities."
She's very supportive.
Another opportunity that I didn't take advantage of but wanted to was when I was, I think about a junior, maybe a sophomore in high school, I was quite a strong figure skater. And I saw in the newspaper an advertisement saying that they were having auditions for the chorus line in the Ice Capades. And I got very excited, and I wanted my parents to take me down for these auditions in New York City. And my father, very clever, said, "Dodie, I have an idea. You don't want to be in the chorus line. Why don't you just really work hard? Next year, you try out and get a star position." Of course, I was on to something else by that time. And one of the things I was on to was paying attention to the Corps Cadets. When I was in the 7th or 8th grade, 12 or 13, one afternoon the phone rang and it was for me, and I said, "Okay, sure, I'll meet you there." And my mother said, "Who is that?" I said, "Lou Overton." "Who's he?" "He's a cadet." And she said, "And you made arrangements to meet him?" "I don't think so." And so anyway, get thee to a nunnery. So literally, of course, Anne, my sister, had already gone to St. Mary's, and I was very happy to join her in Peekskill. It was 20 minutes away, and we were allowed to come home 3 weekends a year.
Wow.
Besides, and 3 Saturdays, I forgot that. And but the nice thing was that my sister Julia came also. So for 1 year, Anne was a senior, I was a sophomore, and Julia was a freshman. And this was an Episcopal boarding school run by nuns, Episcopal nuns, and they had the habits and genuflecting and confessional booths and incense, very high church.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the formation of our real strong commitment to the Episcopal Church.
So I think it would be interesting to hear a little more about your parents. Could you tell us about them and their early lives and kind of what...
My dad was also an Army brat. He was born in 1902, March 4th, and he went to West Point as a cadet in 1920. He was a star athlete in both baseball and football, and the coaches and the professors, I think, managed to keep him there for 6 years, which I don't know that they do that anymore. But, and I mentioned earlier that he was truly a star in baseball, and the New York Giants were very interested in having him come. But he was a strong Army officer. Vince Lombardi at one point said, this was years later, that Red was the most outstanding leader that he had ever known, which I think is a wonderful compliment.
Of course.
And George Marshall sent Red to Guadalcanal to interview, at the beginning of World War II, to interview the soldiers to try to get some insight into ideas that they might have that would help other Army people prepare for serious combat in the Far East. And this particular document that my dad wrote, Fighting on Guadalcanal, was published in multiple languages and thousands of copies. And that was his first writing experience. Then Marty Marr was one of my dad's favorites. And Marty was an Irishman who started off at West Point years ago. My dad was a cadet as a barracks policeman, and he always had wonderful stories to tell about leprechauns and all kinds of wonderful things. And so my father got an idea that it'd be wonderful to write a story about Marty Marr. And his sister Nardi was interested in getting into the act. So my dad would interview Marty, write it up, call his sister, who was living in Bronxville, New York at the time, and read it to her over the phone. I'm sure he mailed some of them, but he laughed afterwards, saying that probably the Bell Telephone Company got most of the profit from that book, which was published and then later made into a movie with Tyrone Power, Maureen O'Hare. It was called The Long Gray Line. The book had been called Bringing Up the Brass. Now I do have a confession to make on this
Please do.
at this level.
No more.
As I said, I was quite interested in cadets, but I guess it was just boys in general. And I decided one afternoon that I would go watch the scene being filmed in the West Point swimming pool where young John Wayne's son was playing the part of the plebe. And during the break, I sort of made it known that my father had written the book. I said maybe he would like to have my school was having a dance that weekend. I thought maybe he would like to go. I didn't tell him it was a convent school, and I didn't tell him it was in a gymnasium. But he said, "Oh gosh, I'm flying to. This is a long weekend. I'm flying to Paris for the weekend, so I just can't make it." And I sort of slunk into the ladies' room and stayed there until everyone had left. So anyway, my dad was a very powerful figure in my life and apparently in the lives of a lot of people who knew him. I'm very proud of him, and he went on to publish, well, I think 36 books. And the only one that was made into a movie was the one about Marty Marr.
All right. Could you tell me a little bit about my great-granny Reader? Could you tell me about your mom?
Well, my mother was an extraordinary person. And the older I get, the more I appreciate her. What a special gal she was. When I was young, she was the Girl Scout leader the head Girl Scout leader at West Point. And all of the leaders answered to her, so to speak. She was part of the West Point Ladies Reading Club. And once a year she did extensive research and would entertain her group with some topic that she had spent the year researching. And but above and beyond, she was my dad's support system. And he as much admitted that he would never have been able to have the success in publishing had not been for my mother. She was a very gentle person, as was my mother-in-law, Evelyn. I just was so blessed with these two amazing women in my life. So I would say that's one thing to think about is when you go out looking for a mate, be sure that the mother is someone that you are comfortable with, because they're going to be a part of your life. Sure. And not that you would turn down a wonderful romance, but that don't think for a minute that isn't going to be included in your future.
She sounds like an amazing woman.
She was. I miss both my parents to this day. My sister Ann was 2 years older than I. Ann went to the Presbyterian Nursing School in Philadelphia. She decided after her husband died, sadly, she was a nurse and decided she wanted to do something other than be a nurse for the rest of her life, and was at that time she was a nurse, a registered nurse, and went to George Mason University to finish the last 2 years of her degree, college degree, and then went to Yale Divinity School to become, and she was ordained in the Episcopal Church. And for about 10 or 12 years she taught, she was the school chaplain at St. Margaret's in Tappahannock. And one of the highlights of that period, by that time she had bought a beautiful small cottage, which she said was a mansion for one. It was right on the water and Tappahannock, and every summer she generously hosted a family reunion, and it was a bonding time for all of our families, our children, and Russell's children, and Julia's children, and of course Ann's, and it was a happy time for us. Then Julia was 13 months younger than I, and Russell was a year and a half after Julia. So my mother had 4 children, the oldest of which, in 1940, was 5, and she was busy. So Julia went to Rutgers, and Douglas rather. It was the woman's part of Rutgers. So, I went to Mary Washington. I'll tell you why I went to Mary Washington. My friend, Daryl Heaster, and she remains one of my good friends today in spite of this story, said, why don't you go to Mary Washington? That's where I'm going. Well, I thought, well, hey, why not? And so I applied and was accepted, and we were all ready to go. And she eloped 2 weeks before we were supposed to go. She married Myron Minnick from the class of 55, I believe, cadet. Maybe he was 56, I can't remember, 55. And so I went to Mary Washington by myself. And I was determined I was going to transfer first chance I got. But I felt like a spoiled brat when I got there and realized how beautiful the campus is and how wonderful it turned out to be for me. I got to Mary Washington, and I knew it was the woman's part of UVA, and so I got there and I said, well, where are the boys? You know, yes, I was a little bit preoccupied by it. Anyway, I said, where are the boys? 50 miles that way to Charlottesville. Well, I was ready to go back to West Point. But I stayed and ended up being president of my class a couple of years in a row and president of the honor committee. And it was a very good experience for me. And now Russell, interestingly enough, West Point was not a good place for high school girls to be necessarily. I mean, we had a lot of gals that did very well there, but it was not necessarily a good environment for young boys either, who were permanently stationed at West Point, because the girls, my God, the minute they were 15 years old or so, all they wanted to do was do something with a cadet, because all the facilities and all of the activities and the balls and all that was all with the cadets. So Russell went to Hoosac School in Hoosick, New York, on the Hoosianic River.
Wow.
And then he went on to Columbia and ended up with a master's degree there. His two children, Wendy and Russ, in those days Rusty, ended up being an important part of our lives. And now he is living in New York City. Julia is living with Heather and her family in Connecticut. And sadly, Hugh is deceased. And Anne's family, not only did Anne pass away, but both Vi and Dorothea in the last 6 years have gone. That's a sadness for our entire family. Phoebe has just brought into the world a beautiful little boy, and we're very happy that Peter Martin. And then Dara has a beautiful little girl, and we are very happy that she is also nearby, which means that we can see her.
All right. So I know you had mentioned that ballet was something that you were very passionate about when you were younger. What were some other things during your grade school years and going into college that you were passionate about?
Well, thank you. I really was passionate about ice skating as well as ballet, and Smith Rink was right literally at our doorstep. Our first home at West Point was literally between the football stadium, which was up the hill from Thayer Hotel, and we were right in the middle. And the Smith Rink, which is no longer there, they raised it in order to build a beautiful alumni center. But I was up there every chance I got. In those days, we could walk all over the Post and even Highland Falls. And interestingly enough, when we went down to Highland Falls, we I was in the 3rd grade, and we had our own ID card, but we had to show it. Julie and I would go on our bicycles, and we would have to show our ID card going in and out of Highland Falls. But it wasn't a big problem then, or it wasn't perceived as a big problem. Another passion I had actually was earning money.
Ooh.
I did a lot of babysitting.
Do tell.
And enjoyed that a lot. And I had a very happy childhood.
That's wonderful. So as you mentioned earlier, I know that men were a big passion of yours as well. Can you tell a little bit about how you met the man that you love and you've spent your life with? Can you tell about how you met Grandpa?
Yes, I will. When I first met Daddy, I call him Daddy Dale because we have 2 Dales. When I first met Dale, was, as he mentioned in his interview, it was at an Army Daughters Tea, and it was for the new cadets, and there were only about 10 girls my age at West Point. I mean, so with 2,500 cadets, there was a lot of interest in getting to know who the people were. Our home was a 15-minute walk to the barracks at least. I mean, at the most. But so we were at this tea, and I remember meeting very handsome young plebe, but there was no real aftermath connection. And so when I graduated, I was a senior at St. Mary's, and so that was my last year. And as a graduation gift, my mother, bless her heart, put on a big party for me out at Camp Buckner, where Daddy's class, Dale's class of 58, was having their first summer training camp. And she allowed us how, there are only 20 girls in my class at St. Mary's, so we invited all of them, and the idea was we'd have a big picnic and then match them all up with dates and whatnot. Well, I figured, I remembered, I must have seen Dale again, because I remember that the best looking cadet I knew was Dale Ruby. Right?
Of course.
So I thought, well, it's only fair that I match him up with the best looking girl in the class. Her name was Scotty. I've forgotten her last name.
I thought you were going to say yourself.
And so anyway, I had another date that I had been, so I never considered that I would be his date. So we had a wonderful picnic, but Scotty never showed up. So I was so embarrassed. I mean, here, this catch, and no date. And I apologized. And I said, I can make this up, get you another date. Please let me know. He said, well, what about next weekend? And I said, well, I'm not sure I could get one that fast, but he said, I'm talking about you. And I said, ooh, okay. I think I could do that. So we had a very nice day. Well, I went out on Saturday out on this lake, Popo Open. And then I said I couldn't go out the next day. That was usually what girls did. They went for a weekend, meant Saturday and Sunday. Mm-hmm. And my mother said, didn't he want you to come out for the second day of the weekend? And I said, yes, but I'm afraid I might like him too much and complicate my life. And she said she did not care for the person that I was interested in at the moment, who had incidentally failed out of West Point, had been one of his classmates, but then, anyway, so we did not see each other again. Well, we probably saw each other again, but we didn't have another date until he was a senior and I was a junior in college by that time. And he called, and I think he said on his, accurately, he said, I don't know if you remember me, Dale Ruby, are you married or anything? And I said, no, are you married or anything? My heart was going like this. And then, so anyway, but what got me was, so we had the first date, and we went to the Army Theater, and his good friend, George Michael, had stayed at West Point for some reason over the Christmas break. He didn't go home like all the other first-classmen. And Dale says, guess what, Dodie and I are going to name our first son. And, and he said, Red Ruby. And I said, oh, come on. But he didn't stop talking about marrying me from the first date. Right? Well, maybe there was a second date. But he just carried on like that. And so finally, in the spring, I said, you keep talking about this, about marrying me, but you never asked me. And he got this sort of sheepish look. He said, don't you want to marry me? I said, well, I'd like to be asked. So anyway, we traveled to the West Coast after he graduated, meeting all of his relatives. And Aunt Lottie and Uncle Eldon in Oxford, Iowa. And Daddy, my mother had always told me, visit the home of the person you intend to spend the rest of your life with, because the way they fit, the way the family interacts is very important, and you need to know that. So after the first day in Oxford, Dale said he had a ring in his pocket. Mm-hmm. Oh, incidentally, the way he had figured out what size I was wearing was holding hands with me in the Army Theater, and he would do this. He would figure out my finger, and then he'd go to his finger, and then I mean, it was so odd. It was funny. But he had the ring. I knew he had the ring. No, I wasn't gonna. No, we had to see all the relatives. Well, we got out to, finally, the last relative was going to be Grandma Tobel out in Bison, South Dakota. And he opened the door and threw his arm around Grandma Tobel and said, "Oh, Grandma, I want you to meet." He froze. He couldn't remember my name. I said, "Dodie Reeder." We did not get engaged that night.
Thankfully.
Well, we finally, we got engaged in Tacoma, Washington. And my mother, I always said to my mother, "How do I know which one I'm supposed to marry? I thought I'd been loved so many times, you know, from Cornell on, you know." She said, "When you're so sure of yourself, you tell me and you don't ask."
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, we ought to call and tell them that we're engaged. So we called and said, I said, "Mommy and Daddy, we're engaged to be married." And my father, on the other end of the phone back in West Point, hadn't been told this business about letting him know.
The arrangement.
And so he hung up, he said, "We'll think it over and let you know." He hung up the phone. So we went up to meet my grandmother Dara. She was living with Aunt Jane, my mother's sister, up in Seattle, Washington. And I told Dale I could not wear his engagement ring in front of my grandmother until my parents had okayed it. Well, a telegram came. In those days we had telegrams, which I wish we still had because they were kind of cool. And the doorbell would ring and you'd have some guy out there delivering a message. Anyway. So now, I think, Mariah, you'd like to have Daddy and me do
Yeah,
this
if we
together.
could do this together. All right, so now we have the two of you together, and if you could start by telling us kind of the beginning of your life together, about your wedding and your marriage and the early years.
I'll start by talking about what the suggestion my father came up with. Dale and I did get engaged on the 13th of June, 1958. And
that was engraved in her ring.
Right.
Wow.
And there's a whole story there too.
All right, okay. But anyway, I had my senior year in front of me, and I wanted to finish college, and he was on his way to 3 years in Germany. And so I said, well, we'll just plan it after I graduate, and you can come back and we'll have a nice big wedding. And he said, "Dodie, I can't promise you that they're going to let me go from maneuvers or something that on a particular day that you've sent out engraved invitations for."
She'd been raised at West Point, so her daddy was a big, powerful guy, and she thought maybe the Army would...
No. But anyway, my dad overheard this conversation and said, "Why don't you get married before he goes?" And I said, "You don't need to say that twice." So we picked a date, the 7th of February. And he was going to be after he finished Ranger School. And in those days, married women could not be in the dorms without permission of the dean of women. So my mother wrote that summer, she wrote to the dean of women, and she got permission for me to continue to be in the dorm. And Emily and Diana were my roommates again. And so we planned for the 7th of February after Ranger School.
Well, actually, it was after I finished both Ranger School and Airborne School, and that's important because I went to Ranger School, and then between Ranger School and going to Airborne School, I came home to West Point. I came to West Point, to her home. and recovered a little bit. And then I reported to airborne school
Wow.
the 1st of January, and that takes a month. So I was going to airborne school just before our wedding.
So,
And we were down at Fort Benning, and about half of the guys who were going to be...
you were, not me.
I was down at Fort Benning. About half of the guys who were going to be in the wedding were there at Fort Benning with us. And it included Tom Carpenter, my roommate, and Kerry Martin, who was my roommate senior year, first class year. And Kerry Martin had just gotten his pilot's license. And it included George Walker, who was the #1 man in our class, the top man, top graduate. And we all went to airborne school together, and we finished up, and the plan was I was going to load up my car, drive to West Point for the wedding with all of my uniforms and everything in the car. And Kerry Martin wanted to know if I would ride, if I didn't want to fly to the wedding in that airplane with him. But it ended up being that I was going to drive. Kerry, Tom, and George were going to fly. And I got in the car with George Michael, who was in my company, and we were driving. And we drove into West Point, and
I had to meet him and tell him that the plane had crashed, that Kerry Martin was the pilot, and they had crashed, and that George had been killed, first man in the class, and that both Tom and Kerry were severely wounded and going to be flown to Walter Reed. That was Monday. I met him when he got there. Do you want me to continue for a minute?
yeah.
And then on Wednesday, we got a phone call from his mother. And I assumed that his mom was calling, and mom and dad were calling from the airport. They were coming to the wedding, which was that Saturday. And
They were in Stockton, California.
And Dale's mother allowed us how Dale's dad had slumped over and died on his desk that morning from a heart attack. And our first thought was maybe we should postpone the wedding. And but she insisted that we proceed because that's what Joe would have wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And Dale was on his way to Germany for 3 years. And so George's funeral was Friday at West Point. And we were married on Saturday. And Sunday we flew to California to his dad's funeral. And that was our honeymoon.
Mm.
That was just the beginning of our honeymoon.
Oh, that's right.
Well, actually, the truth is, we flew to the funeral, and then we flew back to Mary Washington. And we went to the Esperanza Motel.
Yes, I had, for $75, I had talked this person who had these trailers into letting me have one trailer for 1 month for $75. And there were planks over the mud to get into
It was under construction.
It was
Wow.
under construction.
Romantic.
And
Well, it was.
and so Dale would sit in the tea shop or the coffee shop, and I would attend classes. One time I came back. Do you want to spend any more time talking about our wedding?
No, that's right. Yeah.
So
We had a beautiful wedding.
I'm sure.
It was beautiful. I will say, it still chokes me up. Because my classmates came from all over to be in the wedding. And I mean, they dropped everything and came to West Point.
Yeah.
It was a tough time.
Good friends to have.
Yeah.
And I know you still have those friends.
And, no.
So we got down to Fredericksburg, and I checked my student back in.
And while he was waiting in the coffee shop, more than one girl kind of made a pass at him.
You know, I'm a newly married man. I had my wedding ring, and
we stopped for gas one time on the way back to Mary Washington from my class, and the guy, in those days, they pumped the gas for you, and this guy says, "Where do you all live?" And Dale says, "My girlfriend and I live in this bride." "Your girlfriend, your wife. And I showed him my ring. I said, "We're married. He said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to tell anybody."
I didn't make that mistake again.
I said, "I'm not your girlfriend, I'm your wife."
So then I dashed off to Germany to join my first unit, and she went back to school. And as expected, I ended up going on maneuvers. So I was out in the field, and we were out in the boondocks, and one of the soldiers came in and said, "Sir, I just got a message. You've got to call Operator 12 in Hamburg immediately." And so I went back to where the headquarters was, and they had a field phone, and you had to crank, and you had to hold the button down or you'd lose connection. So I was holding the button down on the field phone, and I cranked, and I got a hold of this operator and then that operator, and finally I got Operator 12, and Operator 12 said, "You have a phone call from Fredericksburg, Virginia." And I listened, and pretty soon I heard the noise. Ka-clunk, ka-clunk, ka-clunk. The operator had told her she had to deposit $10.25 in order to talk to me. And her message was, "Ann's pregnant." Her sister.
Yeah.
But I heard, "I'm pregnant."
Oh no.
And I almost dropped the phone, but my fingers wouldn't come off of the button. But she finally explained to her sister was pregnant, not her. But
I want to make a little sideline about my sister Ann. Ann, being 2 years older than I, did everything first. You know, she got her driver's license, of course, before I did, etc., etc. And Dale and I got engaged to be married, and Ann didn't have a serious boyfriend. I am going to beat her to the altar. And so that we got engaged 13th of June. Ann met Scott Riggs, and 10 days later got engaged and got married Thanksgiving Day. And I said, "What happened? I'm supposed to be the first one married." And but you know what? Being first had nothing to do with it. It's being, if you're lucky to get the right one to start with, it's a lifetime of happiness. And that's really, we both feel, at least I feel, that we got the golden ring.
what do you mean, "at least I do"?
Okay, could you all tell me a little bit about your journeys with parenthood and your 3 kids and who they became and what it was like raising those 3 kids and having your careers as well?
Having them was a completely different experience than what happens nowadays. We learned that we were going to have a baby, and we didn't know what the sex was, and we went through the pregnancy. Dodie can tell the details of that, but I can tell you that I was just told bring her in when she's ready, and you go on back, and we'll tell you when it's all over. It was absolutely, it was all up to her, and she did a great job.
Well, the Grandma Ruby had been widowed, as we told you earlier, on the 4th of February, 1959. And so this was in 1960, well, yeah, Dale was born a year and a half later, 60. And we encouraged her to come over. She was a nurse, and she was single, and it was easier for her to get away than it was for my mother. And so she came over with the idea that she would be there for 4 weeks. Well, she stayed 4 months at our urging. And but the funny thing was that we were 20 kilometers east of Frankfurt, Gelnhausen, and that's where the baby was going to be born. And so when it came time, obviously, that I was almost ready to deliver, Dale and Grandma Ruby drove me to the Frankfurt hospital, and they said they would keep me and said goodbye to the two of them, and they went back home. And lo and behold, I had little Dale. And they called and said that the baby had arrived, and he weighed, how'd they say?
No, I was sitting in a meeting, and the clerk came in and handed me a note, and it had written on it that baby born, a son, 11 pounds, 9 ounces. No, 11 pounds, 6 ounces.
Yeah.
11 pounds, 6 ounces. And so I took the piece of paper, which was handed to me, and I left the meeting, and I went over to where Mom was, back at our apartment. And I said, well, we've got a boy, and weighed 11 pounds, 6 ounces. And my mother said, that's the biggest baby I ever heard of in my life. It turns out that the clerk had written it down wrong. The baby was born at 11 pounds 6.
No.
11 hours, 11 o'clock 09, but he weighed
6'6".
6'6". That's
6
right.
pounds, 6 ounces.
That's funny.
But, and from the moment little Dale was born, I was magical. God does works in miraculous ways, and motherhood just washed over me with happiness. And it was, and so much so that when we came time to have a second child, I was truly concerned that there's no way I could love a baby as much as I love him. And God takes care of that. Mm-hmm. You've got love in your heart for more. And so there's no doubt that we love Taya and Liz, and if we had had 5 more babies, I'm sure that we would have loved them all with the same embracing wonder that we had when we had our first. We were in Gelnhausen, Germany, and then we moved to Stuttgart. Dale became Gar Davidson's aide, and this was the time of the Berlin Wall going up. Anyway, Taya was born in November of '61, and I just burst into tears of happiness to have a little girl. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that maybe that was the end of our family, but one of the smartest, most wonderful blessings we ever did have was to be blessed with a third, Liz, and it was just having a family and living the dream, it's been all encompassing for us. And God does a lot of wonderful things for us, and intuition for parenthood is amazing. You don't have to read a book, although we've been plenty. It just comes naturally, and so we were very happy and loved to have celebrations with all three of our children. And do you want to add something here?
No, I think it was, reinforced by the fact that our family had been, both of our families had been military families. And because you move around so much, it makes it important to maintain those family ties and those family links and keep up with one another. And in our days, we were writing letters. Nowadays it means, Facebook and things like that. But we were very diligent about writing letters. Dodie's mother was famous for her Dears All letters. She made carbon copies for all four of her children, and sent them, capturing the news of the letters that she'd received and phone calls and so forth. And the network of family communication was marvelous. And no matter what the medium, it's continued to serve our family pretty well. We all keep in touch pretty well, I think.
And we were very blessed, the fact that Ann and Scott, my sister and her husband, and their children, we were stationed twice in Germany with them, which was wonderful. And then we were stationed in the Washington, D.C. area as well. And so that was a true blessing. And one of the things that we enjoyed while we were in Burke, and Ann and Scott were in Alexandria, was exchanging. We took turns on holidays. And one of my favorite memories of when it was my turn, one Easter, I put our two picnic tables together in the living room and put all the furniture aside and set the most grand table with every fancy thing I had. And I saw on the street that somebody was selling rabbits for $5. And I went to, this was right across from that Burke School. And I said, would you let me rent a rabbit for $5? He said, no, I'll sell you a flower. And I said, okay, how about this? How about if I buy it and then bring it back and give you $5 and bring it back on Monday? He said, well, okay. So I had...
Oh, it was a real rabbit.
What?
A real rabbit.
A real bunny. It was a sweet little bunny rabbit. So I kept this as a big surprise. And I had him in a little box, and when it came time, everyone was seated in the dining room, or living room, around this pretty table. And I had on this Easter, I had a silver platter that I had put green grass around, artificial grass, and then I had put the little bunny rabbit in the middle of the platter, and then put my silver punch bowl over the bunny rabbit. And of course, I just knew it was going to be perfect when I put the little bunny rabbit down on the table and lifted the punch bowl, that the bunny rabbit would sit there like this. Forget that. As soon as that rabbit saw that there was an opening, he ran across the table. Everybody grabbed their glasses and all. Luckily, it was not as much of a catastrophe as it was funny. But anyway, we learned to laugh a lot. And I think that Um, you know, you reflect back on what makes a happy marriage. I think laughter. While we're talking about happy marriages and happy families, I think that we learn early on in our marriage that the magic words, please, thank you, and I'm sorry, were so important to be able to keep the juices flowing and happiness. That and we hopefully taught our children the same thing. And I'm telling you, Dale has thanked me for everything from making the bed till doing the laundry to whatever. Getting gas. I mean, we acknowledge each other's contribution to what makes a family tick. And
That's right, I fully agree.
So I know that you all came back to Burke. Obviously, you spent all that time in Germany, and then you had your military career. But then you reinvented yourselves, and you came back to Burke. You were teaching, and I don't know how long after you got back to Burke you started your company. But can you tell me a little bit about what your life looked like in those years?
Before we do that, I'd like to make a comment about our military service.
Yes, please.
We were both raised in the military and lived a military life, the life of Army brats, and we raised our children that way. And the truth is, at age 85, if they'd allow me, I'd put the uniform right back on.
Mm-hmm.
My time as an officer in the Army, and I think my father's time, and certainly Dodie's dad's time, were probably the most meaningful times of our lives. And I've said many times since I've retired, before I started my second career, that if they'd just let me, if there wasn't such a thing as mandatory retirement, I'd still be wearing a uniform, I'd still be serving with soldiers. And that's the most rewarding thing, other than being a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Working with soldiers in the Army, the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And I look back on it with great pride and satisfaction. And as part of that, I think, as a statement of one of my beliefs, the best Army we ever had was the Army that was full of draftees. It was at a time when every young man knew that he had to serve his nation. Mm-hmm. And nowadays it would be every man and woman, and as a statement of philosophy, it's my philosophy that serving your nation, serving your society, serving your community is essential to being a good citizen and for self-satisfaction. I'd still be wearing a uniform if they gave me a chance.
Mm-hmm.
But I did kick into a second career. But I want to make two points about this. Dodie was a successful educator parallel with my serving in the military. And she went through year after year of serving the community as a teacher. And I always felt that her contributions were equally important as mine.
Completely.
And we shared back and forth between where the emphasis was. And, my career tended to drive things because I had to go where Uncle Sam sent me, but both of us were doing our own share. My second career was a kind of it was a fling because I had not really given much thought about what I was going to do after I got out of the Army, after I was retired from the Army. But I got the opportunity when I ran into my Ranger buddy and classmate from West Point, who had started a company that did home inspections. And I said to him at a cocktail party, home inspections, tell me about that. And he said, this is what you do and this is the service you provide to the home buyer. And I said, I could do that. He said, I know you could do that. Join me. And it was just kind of on that basis that I joined them. But I was still on active duty. And for about 6 months, I was learning how to do that new job while I was getting ready to retire from the Army. And it was an interesting time frame. I went into the home inspection business. We started a company that was very successful. And we ended up selling it just shortly before I retired. And I was very happy with my second career.
Sure.
I felt like I served a lot of young people who were buying homes, and I made sure they weren't buying lemons. And I got an opportunity to be a trainer, and I was training young home inspectors to join our company and know how to do the job properly. So I was a trainer for the latter part of my experience.
I mentioned earlier that my mother urged me to get a certificate that said I could do something when I graduated from college, and I obliged and got a teacher's certificate. I majored in English and minored in education and was qualified to teach grades 4 through 12. And I was never going to teach. But in 1970, when we moved from Quantico to Springfield, we bought a house. And the idea of earning some money to help with that endeavor, I got a job at Lee High School. And I taught there for 3 years. One of my star pupils was Melissa Bloat, who won 3 gold medals in the Olympics at age 15, swimming. And then we went to Germany, and when we were first in Gelnhausen for 2 years, Dale was battalion commander. I did not work outside the home. And then when we moved to Frankfurt, I decided, by gum, I think I would like to go back to teaching. And I went, the day I enrolled Dale and Taya and Liz in school, I mentioned to the principal of the American Intermediate School in Frankfurt that I was a teacher and wondered if he had any openings. Of course, this was pretty late in the season, I mean, right before school started. And he said, well, we're looking for a drama teacher. Can you be a drama teacher? And I said, oh, yes, I can be a drama teacher. So I taught English. And then after school, I was the drama teacher. And we put on Oklahoma 1 year, marvelous. And the next year we put on South Pacific, and it was phenomenal. And Liz was in charge of all the costumes, and so we had a great time with that. When I came back from Germany, it was big time get a job, and I taught at Mark Twain Intermediate and Lake Braddock, for over 20 years. So my teaching career lasted for about 30 years. I didn't say, though, that I did teach ballet. And I started that when I was a brand new bride in Gelnhausen, Germany. That the little girls, the Sonnell girls, as a matter of fact, allowed us how they didn't like being in Germany because they couldn't take ballet. And I said, well, I can teach you ballet. So I taught there for 2 years, and then ended up teaching at West Point for 2 years, or 3 years, I think it was. And also taught in Garrison. So my ballet years came back to serve me well with that, and I enjoyed it.
I have to say that Dodie was kind of the hit of, when we were in Gelnhausen, I was a second lieutenant. Dodie was teaching ballet. She taught at the officers club. And of course, she was teaching all these little girls in their tutus. And she was dressed in a teacher's outfit, I mean, leotards and so forth. And she is and was a striking, beautiful figure in teaching ballet. And there were several of the young officers who used to like to find an excuse to go up to the officers club to see what was going on. And you would find them peeking through the door, the keyholes, to see what was going on with the Dodie teaching ballet. But we did have a wonderful ballet recital in the elementary school in Gelnhausen. And I was sitting behind one of the battalion commanders. Again, I was a lieutenant. And up on the stage of the elementary school were all these little girls in their tutus. They were dancing to, I don't know, the Fairy King or something. And Dodie was teaching, it was giving them cues and so forth. And the colonel turned to his wife and said, you know, having ballet here in Gelnhausen is like the British stopping for tea in the jungle.
Oh my gosh.
Oh dear. Well, we had a lot of fun, and and one of the things that tickled me was that each of the 3 children had their own personality and had their own interests. And when Dale was in Vietnam, young Dale was in the choir, in the church choir in Highland Falls, the Episcopal Church. He was in Scouts and he was in basketball. So he was very active. And Taya was taking ballet classes, and sadly, to the chagrin of Elizabeth, she didn't get to be in the recital. She was too young.
Oh.
In retrospect, I wish I had found a spot for her, because I think she would have been wonderful. But I think that perhaps one of the great joys in life that I hadn't anticipated was seeing our own children become parents. And not only to watch them parents, but joy in the fact that they each found such wonderful partners. Kristen and Dale were magical, and then came Taya and Brian, and then Liz and Terry, and everything just clicked. And their children have just overwhelmed me with the happiness and the love that they have given us and shared with each other. And it just, I can't say enough about it. And then P.S., we're great-grandparents. Oh, so that has been our oldest grandson, Brian Christopher, has given us 3 great-grandchildren, and then Hayden has given us 1, and we just are so grateful for God's love. And when I'm talking about God, I do want to say one thing about how blessed we have been through all these years with God's love. And Dale and I taught Sunday school for years together in St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and everybody remembers, for over 38 years. And it's been something that's been important to both of us, and that is realizing that something that's bigger than we are, and the wonder of it all, and the blessings. So that you said at one point, Mariah, you would like to see if we had any advice.
Yes, so I know, I mean, you all have this wonderful life here at Patriots Colony, and you've moved into this part of your life. What, looking back, what advice would you give for us, this next generation that's moving into starting our lives and finding our life partners and having children? And
well, I would say, number one, be true to yourself. Be yourself, and don't let anyone else superimpose themselves on you. Find a partner that you can share values with, and not just share values with, but be happy with, and be joyful with. And I think that God works wonders in instinct. Follow your instincts, and be willing to realize that you're not perfect, and accept the fact that perhaps someone might make a suggestion here and there that you might do something differently than you were so confident doing, and be receptive to that. And hopefully, if you have suggestions for your partner, to give them lovingly, and such a way that they would be, your suggestions would be received in a loving fashion. As I said earlier, the magic words are please, thank you, and I'm sorry. And don't ever forget
I think
that.
I'd add a fourth word.
What's
I
that?
love you.
Oh, yes. Oh, hey. I love you. Hey, I should have said that too. In fact, that comes first. Oh, dear. Well, we are very, very fortunate. You have some words of wisdom?
No, I always liked what Scott said.
Oh, yes.
He said that life in a marriage isn't 50-50. People like to say that it's 50-50. But it's really kind of a rotating 60-40.
okay.
Sometimes one person is right, the other person is not so right. And it flips around. And
Well,
goes
it
the other
isn't
way.
just right and wrong. It's
No,
leading the way.
It's leading the way and sharing the burden and carrying the load and so forth. But one of the most important principles of it all is others. You've got to think of others. If you're only thinking of yourself, then a marriage doesn't work. If you're only thinking of yourself, then your unit doesn't perform well.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only thinking of yourself, it's difficult to get along with your neighbors. You've got to think of others, and you've got to put others very high on the priority and suppress ego.
I also have an imagery that I like, that I heard about years ago, and that is a good marriage. Actually, this works with friendship too. Is walking through doors together. Don't race ahead and let the door slam in the face of your partner or your friend. And hold the door open and encourage them to come through it at the same time you are. Maybe you're leading the way, But I like that imagery because it's so easy to go through a door that you just captivates you and leaves the other one behind
Mm-hmm.
in an awkward,
Yeah.
lonely way.
Sure.
But Mariah, you are amazing.
Thank
Now, I have to say that Mariah is our only granddaughter. And if we're only going to have one granddaughter, she couldn't be better than Mariah.
I love
Thank you,
guys.
honey.
I love you guys.
Love
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.